As we come on the air tonight, much of America shutting down.
We will shut you down, we will arrest you, and we will take you to jail.
The welfare of humanity has always been the alibi of tyrants.
I think regional quarantine facilities are going to be needed into the future. We'll also need it for unvaccinated people.
So this, I'm going to give you a warning, yeah?
Warning. Due to the national state of emergency because of COVID-19, we must ask for everybody to stay inside. Thank you for your collaboration.
Is this the future you want for us?
An alle kritisch denkenden Menschen! Schließt euch an! Schließt euch an!
It isn't about breaking the fourth wave. It is all about breaking people.
We do not comply! 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 We do not comply!
We are in a strange place, you know. In a strange place, in the corona lockdown, you know. That would be the opening. That would be the opening.
I have never seen the great lawn so empty. This is not life. The government is destroying people's lives, just creating fear, making people behave rationally.
I was very puzzled since the very beginning, and I was alert to the fact that what we were living was not quite right.
It was like a programmed and orchestrated action, which was almost in the same way all over the world.
There must be a plan behind this when it turns out that the pandemic isn't a pandemic, but it's just something like the common flu, and when it turns out these people who are telling us about these PCR tests are lying to us. So the next question, of course, is who's doing this for what purpose?
This is a very, very serious matter. It has nothing to do with hygiene. It has to do with criminology.
You're regularly pledging obedience to things which are not logical.
Are we somehow fueling the very system that is harming us? If you have fear, root it out. If you've decided someone or something is so important that you give up your liberty, re-examine that decision and claim your liberty over whatever that thing is.
I would say the most striking thing about this whole experience has been just feeling alone, you know, and kind of being told that we don't matter or that we're crazy and that we're being sacrificed for greater good. And that's been really the hardest thing for me.
Communist system really wanted to separate us. It was not called social distancing, but practically it was the same idea and the same logic, not to let us go together to talk and potentially to prepare a revolution to destroy communism.
I want people to feel free again, not suppressed, incarcerated.
When I first heard the phrase lockdown, for example, I hope, like most people, I thought this is a phrase you use in relation to controlling unruly prisoners.
They have lockdowns in prison when there's some particular trouble, and they want all the inmates confined to their cells so they can deal with the problem. And we're not inmates in society. We're not subjects of a king. We're supposed to be citizens in a participatory democracy.
It's a control measure. And I think pretty much all that has happened since is to do with control.
So when you hear lockdown, that ought to set off alarm bells somewhere in the recesses of your mind, because that's not the kind of phrase that politicians ought to be using in any sort of free society.
It was clear to me from the beginning that this is unconstitutional, this is completely illegal.
Ventilators, ventilators, ventilators. What am I going to do with 400 ventilators when I need 30,000? I didn't know what they were a few weeks ago. Flatten the curve, flatten the curve, flatten the curve.
Well, the COVID-19 narrative started in the mid-spring with this idea that we were going to flatten the curve or we're going to slow the spread. In fact, the White House campaign was 15 days to slow the spread.
And the reason of being in need to flatten the curve was because we needed to spread the hospitalization of people.
Well, what actually happened is that the healthcare system absorbed the shock. We had thousands of beds at the Javits Center that continued to be open, a Navy ship that sat next to Manhattan that had no use. And so the story almost immediately changed. The narrative transitioned seamlessly into effectively a kind of rolling barrage of lockdowns and shutdowns and quarantines and mask wearings, presumably in order to just prevent the spread of the virus itself.
When WHO asked to eliminate the virus, claiming that we are able to bring it down, lock it down, close it down.
Is that possible?
Eliminate it? Definitely not. Yeah. Definitely not.
Whatever the argument was at the beginning, we now actually have the evidence. And we know we can actually look at the states that locked down and the states that didn't. We can compare countries that locked down with countries that did not.
The countries that did a lockdown, proper lockdown, had the peak, the Alpine peak, the peak of the Alps, if I could say, when Sweden got a much more flattened curve, although they didn't do any lockdown.
You'd like to believe that lockdowns may have been costly, but at least they were beneficial. The reality is that lockdowns were virtually all pain and no gain.
So what we do is we quarantine the sick. We've always done that. We've quarantined the sick because that's how you avoid infecting the wider population. So the idea of quarantining the well, this so-called lockdown, is a new invention, and it has no foundations whatsoever, either in science or in the history of controlling epidemics.
We should work towards herd immunity to end the lockdowns and reopen businesses. Basically, young, healthy people should get naturally infected, the vulnerable should be protected, and we can thus reach herd immunity.
Most public health experts say that is a dangerous path.
I think that that's extremely unrealistic.
Herd immunity is not so much a policy as it's a fact of nature.
There is no superhero who is immune from this disease.
The fact of questioning whether we would have an immune response to it was very, very strange.
We need to learn some tough lessons from this. I'm talking about honoring the decades of work in science that have gone to contribute to our present understanding of virology, transmission, epidemiologic factors. We've had it said that if you're going to go from point A to point B, you got to wear a mask, but once you're at point B, you can take the mask off, doesn't matter. We have absolutely sacrificed science and thrown it at the feet of panic and frenzy.
Do any of the restrictions of public life make any sense?
No, none at all. In fact, that's why they should be lifted immediately, all of them.
Border closures, school closures, social distancing, there's almost no science behind most of these.
We really can't take a crisis like this and turn it over to politicians, bureaucrats, academicians, and intellectuals.
COVID-19 is approximately equivalent in lethality to seasonal flu.
The infection fatality rate for this new coronavirus is likely to be in the same ballpark as seasonal influenza.
I think it will be like a severe influenza season, the same as which would be on the order of 0.1% maybe.
Given this virus represents, at worst, a slightly bigger risk to the old and ill than does influenza, and a less risk, a smaller risk, to almost everyone else who's younger and fit, it was never necessary for us to have done anything. We didn't need to do anything. Lockdowns, masks, mass testing, vaccines even.
I was sitting at my desk, and I was swamped that day. Sick patients, trying to keep up with what was going on in the Senate. And I was flipping through emails, and I scrolled down, clicked on an email from the Department of Health, and when I got to the bottom of it, where it seemed like it was coaching me to use COVID-19 as a diagnosis in situations that I wouldn't have used influenza or any other specific viral diagnosis without having tested for it. And frankly, my thought was, damn it, that's not the way we should be doing things. And what struck me right away was that I felt like I was being coached to go ahead and use COVID-19 without using the same standards of precision that I would for other things. If I'm going to make a diagnosis, I believe as a physician, I have an obligation to use the tools available to me to nail it down with as much certainty as possible. And it seemed to me that the Department of Health and the link to the CDC document that said that you could diagnose COVID-19 as a cause of death on a death certificate, it seemed to me that those two documents in tandem went against all that I had been taught or doing for the last 35 years.
There were enormous changes made in attribution of causes of death. So we'd never had anything as absurd as the rule that is now used. So if you should die within 28 days of having a positive result in an inappropriate test using molecular biology, then you would be declared to have died of COVID-19. That's just wrong. It's not just a matter of disagreeing professionally, it's just complete nonsense.
Technically, even if you died of a clear alternate cause, but you had COVID at the same time, it's still listed as a COVID death. So everyone who's listed as a COVID death doesn't mean that that was the cause of the death, but they had COVID at the time of death. I hope that's helpful.
What CDC has said is anybody that tests positive, if they then die, that's a death amongst cases.
How many have died from COVID-19 that do not have any other underlying health condition?
Nationally, the numbers are vanishingly small. In less than 10%, I think I saw something like 6%.
You just divide those numbers that are presented to you by the press by a factor of 10, and then you're down to earth. And when you do this, in Germany, for instance, you come to a number that starts to be absolutely ridiculous. You have to realize that in Germany, 2,500 people are dying every day. Of these, 10 have been dying because of COVID-19. But of these 2,500, 1,000 are dying because of heart attack, another 800 are dying because of cancer, another, and at least 50 are dying because of pneumococcal pneumonia, 5 times more than COVID.
There is no more deaths in 2020 than other years, and they're not stopping the pandemic. They're not stopping this mess. So there is a problem of governance, because it is clearly one person directing. Would an NGO that has become a business international organization would feel immunity given by the Swiss government? So who's directing the Swiss government is the big question. Like, who is directing really the United Nations?
A record average of more than 80,000 cases a day now in this
more
country.
Than 47 states, and the number of new cases is rising faster than ever. And why?
None of us have ever been told to slow down on testing. In fact, we will be doing more testing.
We have a simple message for all countries: test, test, test.
In January 2020, another thing started, and that was that there was a test, a PCR test, that was invented by Mr. Drosten, and it was accepted by WHO, and the WHO said, yes, when the test is positive, we have a case of COVID-19.
So the meaning of the word case has been changed during the data collection of an epidemic. That is, for an epidemiologist and for everybody else, the worst thing that can happen.
Because I realized very quickly that it was used to define cases. Cases, for us, in our language, is about patients. And here, the cases became the positivity to PCR. So forget about the individual, it was just a result from a technique.
They're now calling apples oranges. And now there are many oranges, many more than there were before. Before they called apples oranges.
Even the WHO agrees that, that it's not enough for a PCR test for you to test positive on a PCR test, but you need symptoms. And it's never in the history of mankind, in the history of medicine, there has never been testing of healthy people.
You should not be using this test on people without symptoms.
Mass testing of people without symptoms has no underpinning science at all. It's just a way of frightening people.
It creates the impression that something bad is happening because there are so many cases. No, there are not so many cases.
We finally built this crisis with this new definition of cases based on this PCR testing.
And this is how they started counting the cases. What they counted was the activity of testing. And the more they tested, the more cases they found.
$100 billion to roll out a nationwide testing.
For starters, we're at about 1 million tests per week.
To the point where there will be millions of tests per several weeks.
What we experience at the moment is nothing more than a PCR test pandemic.
There's no connection between what happened, the accident from Wuhan laboratory, and the spreading of the test are two different things that not need to be connected, because the test is positive with viruses that exist long ago, that exist before. They are positive with all beta coronaviruses, with lots of SARS viruses that exist around 20 years already, all over the world.
But we have created a situation where so many people are so fearful that reality doesn't enter their mind anymore.
The PCR method developed by Mullis, who got the Nobel Prize for this, he himself said, do not use this test for diagnosis.
He said, and made it very clear, this is not a technology to be used for diagnosing viral disease. This is a technology that can help us take a small strand of DNA material and, if you will, manufacture billions times more so we can work with it and learn.
And with PCR, if you do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. It starts making you believe in the sort of Buddhist notion that everything is contained in everything else, right? I mean, because if you can amplify one single molecule up to something that you can really measure, which PCR can do, then there's just very few molecules that you don't have at least one single one of them in your body, okay? So that could be thought of as a misuse of it, just to claim that it's meaningful.
This test should be trashed immediately, worldwide. And it should be considered a criminal act for anyone to be sent to quarantine because this test was positive.
Since early February, we have said that asymptomatic people can transmit COVID-19.
We are constantly looking at this data. It still appears to be rare that an asymptomatic individual actually transmits onward.
We know that most of the spread are from asymptomatic people, particularly young adults.
Children under the age of 10 can be asymptomatic carriers of the virus.
Very difficult. It's very hard to fight an invisible enemy.
We could be sick, we could be infected, and asymptomatic, not showing any symptoms.
In all the history of respiratory-borne viruses of any type, asymptomatic transmission has never been the driver of outbreaks. The driver of outbreaks is always a symptomatic person. An epidemic is not driven by asymptomatic carriers.
This idea, for example, that you can be ill even though you have no symptoms, and you can be a respiratory virus threat to someone else even though you have no symptoms, that's also invented in 2020.
It is complete nonsense. It's never been shown. It's a claim that has been spread as a fact, and this I consider criminal.
And this asymptomatic is a terrifying definition because it makes you, the others, anyone that I meet, as the enemy. You have become a potential enemy to me because you're potentially bringing with you the SARS-CoV-2. And this is actually terrible because it denies the capacity of a person to be a healthy person. Because if asymptomatic exists, then who is healthy? No one.
Anyone who is surrounding us, our relatives, our friends, and who shows no symptoms, who's perfectly healthy or appears perfectly healthy, could be a threat. That's what that's what this induces. That's what this fraud, there are asymptomatic infections, induces. It tells us, oh my God, everybody could be potentially dangerous. That is not true.
It was not clear whether an asymptomatic person could transmit it to someone while they were asymptomatic. Now we know from a recent report from Germany that that is absolutely the case.
The asymptomatic infection is based on a scientific paper which was published by Drosten, and this Chinese woman, which is quoted in that paper, was not asymptomatic at all. She was sick, she had the normal flu, so this claim that this Chinese woman was asymptomatic is a fraud. It's not true.
In order to transmit a virus to be a good, efficient source of infection, you have to have a lot of virus. And if you have a lot of virus, then the virus is attacking you and you are fighting back. That process produces symptoms inevitably. It's not just occasionally, it must always happen.
That's what they obviously want to get through, that asymptomatic healthy people are a threat to the community. So that everybody has to be tested and then vaccinated. When you are vaccinated, and then they say then you are free again until the next mutation comes, and then we have to do the next vaccine. So it's an endless game. Yeah, you can do it every year again.
As we know from a big study in China now, we are very sure that there is no such thing as asymptomatic transmission of COVID-19. We don't have it. You don't have to be afraid.
The World Health Organization quietly changed the definition of the term herd immunity this year. The newer definition focuses on vaccines only and removes the line about building herd immunity through previous infections.
Herd immunity is a concept used for vaccination, in which a population can be protected from a certain virus if a threshold of vaccination is reached.
WHO is in Geneva, the headquarters, and it's the World Health Organization, and it is responsible to coordinate for member states and also to take care, for example, of the international classification of diseases.
If I have to say something about the crisis, I think it's a crisis of the language, and especially in science and in medical sciences. There were a number of words that we could not connect properly.
A big problem with WHO is they're changing definitions without scientific validation at the international level. They're changing the definition of epidemic, of pandemic.
We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic. Pandemic is not a word to use lightly or carelessly. It's a word that, if misused, can cause unreasonable fear.
Everyone who in the street would notice that there is a pandemic, because the neighbors would get ill, the people at work would get ill. In the bus, you would see the people coughing. You would really, a pandemic, you cannot oversee it. It's something each of us would experience. This was a pandemic, and the WHO changed it.
Why the WHO
then we have heard that
frightened the world
the
with
definition
a scare that didn't turn
of
out
the
to be a
pandemic
substantial one.
has been changed. But I've heard no reason why.
Die WHO saß also hier am Abzug dieser ganzen vorbereiteten Transaktion.
The scientific criteria for an influenza pandemic have been met.
There was a new definition that had been coined by the World Health Organization in 2009. It suppressed the notion of severity.
The pharmaceutical industry pressed WHO to change the pandemic, the definition of pandemic, and they just wiped out that there should be many severe cases and many deaths. You can change a definition and you can change the world. And we had this change of a definition, and with this change of a definition, it was the tool how the fear was driven worldwide.
In the spring of 2009, public health officials were alerted to an unusual outbreak of influenza. The world was confronted with a new flu virus to which it appeared no one had immunity. The potential existed for a severe pandemic.
They changed the pandemic, the definition of pandemic again, just some month ago, when they said we have something like a permanent pandemic. We have an interpandemic period, and then we have a post-pandemic period, and then we have the pandemic period. And they said they made us think and understand pandemic as a permanent thing with waves coming again and again. And this is the picture now WHO uses, and this is also what Bill Gates uses, what the pharmaceutical industry uses. They frighten us with the next wave to come and with new mutations. So it's a very good business model.
They're not complying to the obligation that they have to coordinate information but not to decide for member states. And today you see clearly they are deciding unilaterally. Now we have a political problem. They are responsible for having announced and having obliged as leaders given recommendation to get the vaccination that is experimental. So where is the consequence? So this goes higher.
By the time we got to about the third main theme of this pandemic and how to control it, I knew I was being lied to all the time by government, scientists, their advisors, by ministers, people on the TV. And I'm afraid that impression has simply firmed up as time has gone on.
Suddenly I saw too many lies and too many different rhetorics, uncertainty. I wrote an article in Acta Biomedica on WHO International Health Regulation uncertainties, and in that I was already questioning. So I questioned, and I saw very well that there was something wrong.
A number of scientists and doctors who have been saying, we have trouble declaration of Great Barrington, we have trouble doctors for ethics, we have trouble 57 scientists, in which I am as well, putting a paper on asking to stop the vaccination. But it seems as though nobody listened. And it's sad because we need those discussions. We need to be face-to-face and to have this discussion and to force the laboratories to provide the answer to all this.
So as time went on, I found when I talked to fellow scientists, often retired scientists or academics, people I grew up with who are now hold chairs in immunology, they would agree with me privately that PCR testing as it was being done was completely nonsense and fraudulent, that The attribution of deaths in the way we've done it is completely stupid. Lockdown clearly was irrational and probably killing lots of people. But the difference was they were not willing to say anything in public because they said it's been intimated that the authorities in the university don't want us to challenge the government narrative or that of its advisors. So we're not. And that's what happened. We ended up with people looking the other way.
Some of them, they get a lot of money that they say the opposite. And some of them are just afraid to lose that job.
You have people who told me, you shouldn't discuss. This is a bad situation. Everybody must be at the order, saying, okay, this is like that.
And this is, to me, very similar to the Soviet time where I lived. There was only one meaning, admitted. And when you had another meaning, you were declared as an enemy, or as a spy, or as a conspiracy theory. This did the Soviet powers. When you had another opinion, you were said, you are a conspiracy group. You have a conspiracy theory. And you have hate speech. This expression hate speech came from the communists.
People should oppose all kinds of government's restrictions, and this is the only lesson which we have learned from the history, and especially which we have learned from our communist era.
It's when we delegate authority to some central government whose dealings now are totally intertwined with very big business, and pharmaceutical industry is just about one of the least ethical of all. And they are being given access, total free access to our bodies, our minds. What could be stupider than that? I mean it truly as stupid, not everyone is evil. But a lot of stupid people bring the evil ones into positions that they should never be in.
It's government by decree. It's government by confusing and contradicting rules and regulations. So that's what they're trying to do. And why are they doing this? This is a psychological operation, because the only way you can get people to do stuff that they otherwise wouldn't do is by keep them in a constant mode of panic.
Fear makes us act totally irrational. And that's what we see. Nothing makes sense here.
This creates a situation whereby people give up on using their own minds. They delegate their minds to the herd, to the authority. I don't know what to think anymore. It's so absurd, all this contradictory information.
Human beings crave coherence. And so if you can put them in a state of incoherence, they will literally do anything they can to get back to coherence. It's a typical torture tactic. If you just do what I want, I will allow you to go back to a state of coherence. So if you just accept the passports, you'll be free. Or if you get the vaccination, you'll just be free.
I never thought I'd be in a situation where I could imagine what it might have been like to be in Guyana with Jimmy Jones in 1978. What must it have been like for those people to incrementally move towards a place where finally they were willing to drink cyanide-laced Kool-Aid, hour in, hour out, day in, day out, week in, week out, month in, month out, one story after another, one piece of bad news after another, one more sensationalized headline. It's almost like we're slowly being beaten down until we get to a point where we say, Uncle, I give up. I'll drink the Kool-Aid.
Nowadays, the people, when they have a question, they don't try to find an answer, and they don't try to collectively find an answer with their friends or their family and something rooted in the reality. They go into consulting Wikipedia, and they will have a direct answer given by a kind of a superior consciousness that would be the digital world. But it's grounded in a lie.
Schools, the quality
is very, very low and is growing lower and lower because keeping people ignorant is the key to success in that case.
I think we should de-invest, we should go away from this illusion, from this delusion, and go back to the real. And that's my advice. I'm a doctor, I can prescribe you something. I prescribe you to turn off the TV, turn off your smartphone, get back to the reality.
Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta. These are the variants of the coronavirus. And there is a new one now, called the Delta Plus.
It sounds startling.
The variant of concern.
A new double mutant.
We are worried about the Delta variant.
Double mutant strain.
Should we fear the Delta variant?
Absolutely.
Growing concerns about Omicron, the new coronavirus strain.
The fifth variant of concern.
You don't want to frighten the American public, but when something occurs that you need to take seriously.
We are seeing clinically in South Africa. It's extremely mild. For us, that's mild cases. We haven't admitted anyone. I spoke to other colleagues of mine. The same picture.
We have 48 cases in California we've identified, and the vast majority, overwhelming majority, have been fully vaccinated.
You see these people got infected with Omicron. All of them showed mild or no symptoms.
I would just want to urge everyone, vaccines work. Vaccines are effective.
It's going to take longer to beat COVID-19 and all the mutations we're seeing if we don't vaccinate the rest of the world fast.
You've been